Still, when every nurse on shift had already stepped back to make room for the crash cart, a boy in torn sneakers stood at the edge of the trauma bay and said four words that made the entire emergency room stop moving for exactly 1 second. "I know CPR, sir." Nobody in that room, not the attending physician, not the charge nurse, not the security guard already moving to pull him back, understood yet why those four words, spoken by a boy who looked like he had walked in off the street rather than through the ambulance bay, would end up mattering more than anything else that happened in that hospital that night. The boy's name was Desmond, though everyone at the shelter where he had spent the last year called him Des. He was 13 years old. He had walked into Street Augustine Memorial's emergency room, not as a patient and not as anyone's family member, but because he had been following, at a careful distance, an ambulance that had passed him on the street 20 minutes earlier. Its lights cutting through the evening the way they always did, the way that had, for the past 3 years, made something in Dez's chest tighten with a very particular kind of attention. Before we go any further, if you believe that knowledge saved under the hardest circumstances can still show up exactly when it's needed most, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that preparation and compassion can live inside anyone, regardless of what their circumstances look like from the outside. Now, back to the story. Des had not always followed ambulances. He had started 3 years earlier, when he was 10, in the exact week his mother had collapsed in their kitchen from a cardiac arrest that neither of them had seen coming, a hidden heart condition nobody had caught in time. Des had been alone with her. He had called for help. He had knelt beside her on the kitchen floor, 10 years old, terrified, with no idea what to do beyond holding her hand and waiting. And by the time paramedics arrived, 6 minutes had passed. 6 minutes that the doctors later told him, gently but honestly, had likely been the difference between the outcome they got and the outcome they might have had if someone in that kitchen had known what to do. His mother survived, but barely, and with lasting complications that eventually required her to move into long-term care, a transition that left Des, without other close family able to take him in the foster and shelter system for the years that followed. It was during his first months at Haverford House, a shelter for unaccompanied minors, that Des had made a decision that would define the next 3 years of his life. He decided that he would never again be the person in the room who did not know what to do. A shelter volunteer named Rosalind, a retired ICU nurse who came in twice a month to run informal first aid sessions for the shelter kids, had noticed Des sitting in the back of her very first session, silent, intense, taking in every word with a focus she rarely saw in kids his age. She had pulled him aside afterward and asked why he seemed so invested, and Des, after a long hesitation, told her the truth about the kitchen floor, about the 6 minutes, about the promise he had made himself. Rosalind, moved by his honesty, began giving him extra time after each session, teaching him not just the basics she covered for the group, but deeper, more thorough instruction, showing him properly how to assess responsiveness, how to position hands for compressions, how to count the rhythm that could keep a heart's rhythm alive until help arrived. Des practiced obsessively. On a resuscitation dummy, Rosalind eventually managed to get donated to the shelter, on pillows, on his own arm, counting the beat against his pulse, until the rhythm became something closer to instinct than memory. He read everything Rosalind gave him, worn pamphlets, an old first aid manual with a cracked spine, and eventually, once a shelter caseworker helped him get a library card, medical books meant for adults twice his age, absorbing everything he could about the body, about emergencies, about the fragile window of time between collapse and either recovery or something far worse. He began following ambulances not out of morbid fascination, but because some part of him, the part still standing in that kitchen at 10 years old, feeling helpless, needed to know that he would be ready if he was ever again the only person in the room when someone's life depended on quick, correct action. He rarely got close enough to actually help with anything. Mostly he watched from a distance, learning by observation what he could not learn from books alone, the pace paramedics moved at, the calm authority in their voices, the specific choreography of a real emergency response. That evening had been different from the start. The ambulance he had been following had been moving unusually fast, weaving through evening traffic with an urgency that told him, even from a distance, that whatever was happening inside it was serious. He had followed it the 6 blocks to St. Augustine Memorial, arriving at the ambulance bay entrance just as the doors burst open and paramedics wheeled in a stretcher, carrying a man who appeared to be in his 50s, unconscious, a family member, a woman who Des would later learn was the man's wife, running alongside, sobbing, trying to explain to the trauma team what had happened. The man's name was Harold Kessler, 62 years old, a retired firefighter who had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest at a restaurant table while celebrating his 40th wedding anniversary with his wife, Miriam. Paramedics had performed CPR in the ambulance and gotten a pulse back briefly, but by the time they wheeled him into the trauma bay, he had gone into cardiac arrest again, his heart's rhythm collapsing into something the monitor displayed as a flat, terrifying line. Before we continue, we want to pause here, because what happened in the next several minutes unfolded with a speed that made it difficult, even for the trained professionals in that room, to process everything as it occurred. The trauma team began working immediately. Chest compressions, the crash cart being wheeled in, the attending physician calling out instructions in the clipped, urgent shorthand of a team that had done this many times before. And somewhere in the chaos, unnoticed at first because everyone's attention was fixed entirely on the patient, a 13-year-old boy who had followed the ambulance in through the doors that had not yet closed slipped into the edge of the room. Des was not trying to insert himself into anything. He had simply frozen at the sight of the flat line on the monitor, the particular sound of that alarm triggering something in him that felt precisely like standing in his mother's kitchen 3 years earlier. What made this moment different was that this time, Des did not feel helpless. He felt, for the first time in the 3 years since that afternoon, something closer to readiness. It was when he saw the resident performing compressions begin to visibly tire, her arms shaking with the particular exhaustion that comes from sustained high-intensity compressions, her rhythm faltering slightly as fatigue set in, that Des spoke. He did not shout. He said it clearly, steadily, the way Rosalind had taught him to speak in an emergency, calm enough to be heard, urgent enough to be taken seriously. "I know CPR, sir. Her rhythm's slowing down. Someone needs to switch with her before it drops more." The room did not stop because a stranger had spoken. It stopped because what he said was, unmistakably, precisely, medically correct, delivered with an accuracy that no untrained bystander could have offered by accident. The attending physician, Dr. Amara Osi, glanced at the resident's compressions, realized in that instant that the boy was right, that fatigue had indeed begun degrading the rhythm's effectiveness, and made a split-second decision that she would later describe in a debrief with her colleagues as one of the strangest and most correct calls of her career. "Security, hold," she said sharply, cutting off the guard who had already started moving to remove Des from the room. Then, to Des directly, "Do you actually know proper compression technique? Hand placement, depth, rate?" "Yes," Des said. "I've practiced. I know I'm not supposed to be in here, but she's tiring and the depth is dropping. I can do 30 seconds if someone needs a break, or I can just tell you what I'm seeing." Dr. Osi made her decision in under 2 seconds, the kind of instinctive high-pressure judgment call that 30 years of emergency medicine had trained into her. "Talk me through what you're seeing. Don't touch him yet." What followed, for the next several minutes, was something none of the staff in that trauma bay would ever fully forget. Des, standing at the edge of the bay, calmly and accurately narrated what he observed, the resident's compression depth beginning to shallow, the rate drifting slightly off rhythm as exhaustion set in further, offering the kind of precise, real-time observation that even seasoned nurses sometimes missed in the adrenaline of an active code. When the resident finally reached full fatigue and another nurse stepped in to relieve her, there was a brief, critical gap, less than 4 seconds. But in cardiac arrest, every second carries weight, and Dr. Osei, in a decision she would spend weeks afterward explaining to a stunned hospital ethics board, looked directly at Des and said, "Compressions now, until she's in position. Go." Des stepped forward without hesitation, placed his hands exactly where 3 years of obsessive disciplined practice had trained them to go, and began compressions with a rhythm and depth that, for those 4 seconds, kept blood moving through Harold Kessler's body until the relief nurse was fully in position to take over. It was 4 seconds. It was, in the language of emergency medicine, an eternity that mattered enormously, and also barely anything at all in the grand mechanics of the full resuscitation. But for those 4 seconds, a 13-year-old boy who had once knelt helpless on his mother's kitchen floor was the only thing standing between Harold Kessler and a gap in circulation that could have meant the difference between recovery and permanent damage. The team continued working for 11 more minutes. Then, finally, the monitor's flatline broke into an irregular but present rhythm, weak at first, then steadying. Harold Kessler had a pulse. Before we go further, we want to acknowledge the people who made this moment possible long before that trauma bay, because a 13-year-old boy does not learn to save a life in isolation. Rosalind, the retired ICU nurse who saw a grieving child's obsessive attention during a shelter first aid session and chose to give him more than the group curriculum, believing that his need to understand ran deeper than curiosity. A shelter caseworker named Terrence, who noticed Des reading adult-level medical textbooks, and, rather than telling him the material was inappropriate for his age, helped him get a library card so he could access even more of them. None of them were in that trauma bay that night. All of them were. Miriam Kessler, Harold's wife, once the immediate crisis had passed and her husband had been stabilized and moved to intensive care, found Des sitting alone in the emergency room's family waiting area, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline, still processing what had just happened. She sat down beside him and asked him gently who he was and how he had known what to do. Des told her, hesitant at first, the same story he had once told Rosalind, about his mother's collapse, about the 6 minutes, about the promise he had made to himself at 10 years old. Miriam, a retired school teacher who had spent 35 years working with children from every kind of background imaginable, listened to his story with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood immediately that she was sitting beside a child who deserved far more than a passing thank you. She stayed with him at the hospital until a shelter staff member arrived to take him back, and before he left, she asked him if she could visit him again once Harold had recovered enough to meet the boy who had helped save his life. Harold Kessler, once conscious and stable several days later, insisted on meeting Des as soon as doctors allowed visitors. The meeting, arranged carefully with hospital staff and Des's shelter caseworker present, was one that Dr. Osi later described as one of the most emotionally significant moments she had witnessed in her career. Harold, still weak, still recovering, held Des's hand and thanked him. Unable to fully speak through the emotion of understanding that a stranger's child, a boy with no family of his own present in the room, had been the reason he was alive to hold anyone's hand at all. What followed over the next several months was, again, something neither Harold nor Miriam ever framed as charity, and something Des, cautious after years of learning not to expect too much from adults, took time to fully trust. Harold and Miriam, who had raised 3 children of their own who were now grown and living in other states, began visiting Des regularly at Haverford House, first as occasional visitors, then as a more consistent presence in his life, eventually pursuing formal kinship, fostering once they understood the depth of what Des had been carrying alone for 3 years. They enrolled him in a proper school program, arranged for him to continue visiting his mother in her long-term care facility regularly, something the shelter's limited transportation resources had made difficult before, and connected him, through Harold's old firefighting network, with a formal youth EMT training program designed for teenagers serious about pursuing emergency medicine as a career. Des, for the first time in 3 years, was learning not out of desperate necessity, but out of genuine, supported passion. The difference, he would later say, between surviving and actually building something. Rosalind, the shelter volunteer, who had first recognized his focus all those years earlier, remained a consistent figure in his life throughout this transition. Proud in a way she described as feeling almost maternal, watching a boy she had once taught on a donated resuscitation dummy, now training formally toward an actual career in the field that had once saved his own mother's life, and years later helped save a stranger's. 2 years later, at 15, Des completed his youth EMT certification, the youngest participant in his program's history to pass the practical examination on his first attempt. Dr. Osei, who had followed his progress since that night in the trauma bay, attended his certification ceremony and told the assembled group, when asked to speak, that she had witnessed extraordinary technical skill many times in her career, but had rarely witnessed it paired with the kind of composed, compassionate presence Des had shown at 13 years old, standing in a room full of trained professionals, calmly doing exactly what needed to be done. Harold Kessler, fully recovered, attended every milestone of Des's training with the specific pride of a man who understood better than most exactly what those skills meant when a life genuinely hung in the balance. He often told people, when asked about the strange circumstances that had brought Des into his family, that he considered the 4 seconds of compressions Des performed in that trauma bay to be the most important 4 seconds of his entire life. Not because they alone had saved him, but because they represented to him everything about what a person is capable of when years of quiet, disciplined preparation meet a single moment that actually matters. The night before Des's 16th birthday, he sat with Rosalind at her kitchen table, the same table where she had once shown him diagrams of the human heart on a shelter's donated whiteboard, and told her that he had decided, definitively, to pursue paramedicine as his actual career, not simply as a way to prove to himself that he would never again be helpless in a kitchen, but because he had come to understand, through Harold and Miriam and the trauma team that had trusted a stranger's child in the worst moment of their careers, that being ready to help another person was one of the most meaningful ways a life could be spent. In the weeks following the incident, hospital administration at St. Augustine Memorial found themselves in an unusual position, having to reconcile a genuine medical miracle with the uncomfortable fact that a bystander, a minor with no formal medical credentials, had briefly performed hands-on chest compressions during an active resuscitation. Dr. Osi was called before an internal review board to explain her decision, and she did so without apology, telling the assembled panel that in 30 years of emergency medicine, she had learned to trust demonstrated competence over credentials in the seconds that mattered most, and that Des's narration of the resident's fatigue had been more clinically precise than she herself had caught in that moment. The board, after reviewing security footage and staff testimony, ultimately commended rather than reprimanded her judgment, and the hospital quietly updated its bystander protocol in the months that followed to include clearer guidance for exactly this kind of rare, extraordinary circumstance. Terrence, the shelter caseworker, who had first helped Des get a library card, found himself fielding calls from local news outlets in the days after the story became known within the community, all of them wanting to interview the shelter about their remarkable young resident. Terrence, protective of Des's privacy and mindful of how sudden public attention can overwhelm a child already carrying significant trauma, carefully managed which requests were shared with Des and which were gently declined on his behalf, always checking first whether Des himself actually wanted the exposure before allowing any of it to proceed. Des's mother, still in long-term care recovering from the lasting effects of her own cardiac arrest years earlier, learned about what her son had done through a phone call from Terrence. And though her own health limited how much she could process or respond to complex news, the staff at her care facility later told Des that she had cried when she heard the story, understanding, even through her own cognitive limitations, that her son had turned the worst day of both their lives into the reason he was able to save someone else's father, someone else's husband. The relationship between Des and the Kessler family deepened steadily over the following year, built not on the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting, but on the ordinary, patient work of actually getting to know each other. Miriam, drawing on decades of teaching experience, helped Des catch up on schoolwork that years of unstable housing had disrupted, sitting with him most evenings at their kitchen table, the way she once had with her own children. Harold, still processing his own brush with mortality, found that mentoring Des through the early stages of his EMT training gave him a sense of purpose that his retirement from firefighting had left unfilled, teaching him not just technical skills, but the harder, less tangible lessons about carrying the emotional weight of emergency work without letting it consume you. Rosalind continued her twice-monthly shelter visits throughout this entire period, and though Des eventually moved out of Haverford House permanently, once the Kesslers' kinship fostering was finalized, he never stopped attending her sessions when his schedule allowed, eventually helping her teach the newer, younger kids the exact skills she had once taught him. The resuscitation dummy long since replaced by a newer model the hospital had donated after learning the shelter's story. There was a quieter detail from that night in the trauma bay that few people beyond Dr. Osei and her immediate team ever fully understood the weight of. In the seconds after the security guard was told to hold his position, before Des had said a single word about compressions, Dr. Osei had glanced toward the boy, for reasons she herself struggled to fully explain afterward. Some instinct honed by decades of reading rooms under pressure, telling her that the way he stood, still, watchful, entirely unlike the panicked bystanders she usually had to clear from a trauma bay, meant something worth a second look before dismissing him outright. She later told a colleague that in emergency medicine, you learn to distinguish between fear that clouds a person's judgment and focus that sharpens it, and that Des's stillness had read unmistakably as the second kind. Harold Kessler's own 3 adult children, initially confused, and even slightly wary when they learned their parents intended to take in a teenager they had never met under such extraordinary circumstances, flew in within the first month to meet Des in person. Whatever hesitation they carried dissolved within a single dinner, watching the quiet, careful way Des interacted with their father, asking him detailed questions about his recovery not out of politeness but out of genuine clinical curiosity, and by the end of that first visit, Harold's eldest daughter, a nurse herself, had already begun sending Des study materials for his EMT coursework, having recognized in him the same instinct that had drawn her to the profession years earlier. Des's certification ceremony, when it finally arrived 2 years later, drew a crowd that surprised even the program directors who had organized it, accustomed as they were to modest turnouts for a youth EMT track most people outside the field had never even heard of. Rosalind sat in the front row, having taken the afternoon off from her volunteer shift at Haverford House for the first time in years. Terrence came, along with 2 other caseworkers from the shelter who had followed Des's story from a distance and wanted to see, in person, what a happy ending actually looked like after so many years of managing cases that rarely resolved so cleanly. Miriam sat beside Harold, holding his hand the same way she had held it in that trauma bay years earlier, though this time the tears on her face were an entirely different kind. Dr. Ose attended as well, taking time out of a demanding shift schedule because, she told a colleague beforehand, some moments in a career are worth rearranging your calendar for, and this, she felt certain, was one of them. When Des's name was called, and he walked across the small stage to receive his certification, the applause lasted noticeably longer than it had for any other graduate that day, not because the audience knew the full weight of his story, though many of them did by then, but because something in the way he carried himself, calm, steady, quietly proud without ever needing to perform that pride outwardly, made people want to keep clapping a little longer than usual. In his brief remarks afterward, when the program coordinator asked if any graduates wanted to say a few words, Des had not planned to speak, but found himself walking back up to the small podium anyway. He talked, briefly and without excessive detail, about a kitchen floor when he was 10 years old, about 6 minutes that had changed the entire direction of his life, about a shelter volunteer who had once given a grieving child extra time after a group lesson, because she noticed he needed more than everyone else in the room. He said that he had spent 3 years terrified of being the person who did not know what to do, and that somewhere in that fear, without ever intending it, he had become the kind of person other people could count on in exactly the moment it mattered most. He thanked Rosalind by name. He thanked Terrence by name. He thanked Dr. Ose, who he said had done something rare and important that night in the trauma bay, trusting a stranger's competence over his circumstances. And he said he hoped, throughout his own career, to extend that same trust to other people the world might be too quick to overlook. He thanked Harold and Miriam last, his voice catching slightly for the first time in the entire speech, saying that they had not simply given him a home, they had given him proof that the worst moment of someone's life could still, somehow, become the beginning of something worth having. After the ceremony, as the small crowd mingled over modest refreshments in the community center gymnasium where the event had been held, Harold pulled Des aside for a private moment, away from the noise. He told him something he had been holding on to for 2 years, waiting, he said, for the right moment to say it properly. He told Des that in the immediate aftermath of his cardiac arrest, in the disoriented, frightening days of his initial recovery, he had struggled with a particular kind of shame, an unshakable feeling that surviving had made him, somehow, a burden to everyone who had to work so hard to bring him back. He told Des that meeting him, learning his story, watching a 13-year-old boy who had every reason in the world to feel like a burden himself, instead choose, over and over, to become someone capable of helping others, had done more to help him process his own recovery than any of the counseling the hospital had recommended afterward. Des, listening, did not fully know what to say to that, and Harold told him he did not need to say anything at all, that some gratitude does not require a response, only acknowledgement that it exists. The following year, Des began working part-time as a volunteer EMT trainee with the same ambulance service that had originally responded to Harold's cardiac arrest, riding along on shifts under close supervision, gradually building the practical experience that would eventually let him pursue full paramedic certification once he was old enough. His supervisors noted, in his early performance reviews, an unusual quality that they struggled to fully articulate in standard evaluation language, a combination of technical precision and genuine emotional steadiness with patients and families that most new trainees took years to develop, if they developed it at all. Rosalind, watching all of this unfold from the sidelines with the particular quiet pride of someone who had planted a seed years earlier, without ever fully knowing how it would grow, decided, in Dez's third year of training, to formalize what had always been an informal role in his life. She asked the Shelters Board if she could establish a small, dedicated first aid and emergency preparedness curriculum specifically for Haverford House residents, modeled directly on the extra sessions she had once given Dez, but available now to any resident who showed the same hunger to learn that he once had. The board approved it within a month, and the program's first official class included, at Rosalind's specific invitation, Dez himself as a guest instructor, standing in the same shelter common room where he had once sat in the back row as a grieving, silent 10-year-old, now teaching a new group of kids exactly the skills that had once saved his own promise to himself. Miriam, in the years that followed, often reflected that taking in Dez had not felt, to her and Harold, like an act of charity extended toward a stranger, but like the completion of something that had already quietly begun the moment their eyes met across a trauma bay, a recognition, instant and undeniable, that this particular child belonged somehow in the family they had built. She kept, framed on the wall of their living room alongside photographs of their own 3 children at various ages, a photograph of Dez at his certification ceremony, guitar case never appearing anywhere near this particular story, but appearing instead a stethoscope draped around his neck for the first time, an image she said captured, more than any words could, the full distance he had traveled since the night he stood at the edge of a trauma bay in torn sneakers, and said 4 words that changed the course of several lives at once. On the 5th anniversary of that night in the trauma bay, Dr. Osei invited Dez, by then nearly finished with his full paramedic certification, to speak to a group of incoming emergency medicine residents at Street Augustine Memorial, wanting them to understand, early in their careers, the exact lesson that night had taught her about the danger of assuming competence only comes wrapped in the expected credentials. Standing in front of a room of medical professionals nearly twice his age, Dez told the story once more, calmly, without embellishment, ending it the way he always did, by saying that he did not consider himself unusual or exceptional, only prepared, and that preparation, he believed, was something anyone could choose to build, regardless of what their life happened to look like on the outside. Several residents later told Dr. Osei that it was the single most memorable lecture of their entire orientation, not because of the medical content, which was, after all, fairly basic CPR technique, but because of the quiet, unshakable conviction in the voice of the young man delivering it, a conviction built not in a classroom, but on a kitchen floor, in a shelter common room, and in 4 unforgettable seconds inside a trauma bay that had, against every reasonable expectation, changed the course of several lives at once. Never underestimate what a child can learn out of necessity, and never assume that preparation earned in the hardest circumstances is any less valuable than preparation earned in comfort. Never forget that a moment of composed knowledge can matter more in 4 seconds than in years of careful planning. And never forget that sometimes the person capable of saving a stranger's life has already survived, quietly and alone, the exact kind of moment that taught them how. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment about the part that stayed with you longest, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that preparation, compassion, and courage do not require a certain age or a certain address to exist. Subscribe for more stories about resilience, quiet knowledge, and the unexpected people who show up exactly when it matters most. Because sometimes the calmest, most capable voice in the room belongs to the person everyone almost overlooked at the door.